refused to cook this year, and my daughter-in-law arrived anyway, brought nothing, and left my lights on all night. The woman I once welcomed as my own daughter now treated my home like a free hotel. Today, I'm going to tell you something I never thought I would share. And if for even a second this feels familiar, I only ask that you like this video and subscribe. It will help me keep opening my heart. My name is Eleanor, and I'm 67 years old, sitting in my small Queens apartment with trembling hands wrapped around a cold cup of coffee. The morning light filters through yellowed blinds, casting shadows across the linoleum floor I've scrubbed countless times. This kitchen, once filled with the warmth of holiday preparations and the laughter of grandchildren, now feels like a museum of my own exhaustion. For 43 years, I've been the matriarch who made Christmas magical. I was the one who woke at dawn to baste the turkey, who rolled pie crusts by hand while my arthritic fingers screamed in protest, who set the table with my grandmother's china and polished silverware until it gleamed like hope itself. My apartment would transform into a wonderland of cinnamon and nutmeg, of fresh bread and roasted vegetables, of everything that makes a house feel like home. But this year, something broke inside me. Maybe it was the accumulation of decades of thankless service. Or perhaps it was the moment I realized I had become invisible in my own family. The realization hit me like a freight train on an ordinary Tuesday morning in October, when I called my son David to ask about Thanksgiving plans, and heard my daughter-in-law Rebecca's voice in the background saying, "Tell her we'll figure it out later. We're busy." I set down the phone and looked around my kitchen. The same scratched countertops where I'd kneaded thousands of loaves of bread. The same stove where I'd stirred countless pots of soup for sick grandchildren. The same dining table where I'd served meals to people who now treated me like hired help rather than family. That morning, I made a decision that would change everything. I picked up my phone and called David back. My voice was steadier than I felt when I said, "Son, I won't be cooking this Christmas. I'm too tired, and I've decided to take a break from hosting." The silence on the other end stretched like a frozen lake. When David finally spoke, his voice carried a note I'd never heard before. Not disappointment, but irritation. "Mom, you can't just decide that now. Rebecca's already told her family we're having Christmas at your place. Where are we supposed to go?" "You'll figure it out," I said, borrowing his wife's words. "You're adults." The conversation ended with him hanging up on me. I sat in my kitchen for hours afterward, wondering if I'd just made the biggest mistake of my life. But for the first time in decades, I also felt something I'd almost forgotten: the possibility of peace. 3 weeks passed without a single call from my son's family. No check-ins, no holiday planning conversations, nothing. I spent those weeks in a strange kind of limbo, part relief and part heartbreak. I window shopped instead of grocery shopping. I read books instead of recipe magazines. I took long walks through the neighborhood instead of spending hours in the kitchen. My neighbor Rosalie, a 72-year-old retired teacher with silver hair and eyes that missed nothing, knocked on my door one evening. She brought homemade soup and stayed for tea, listening as I poured out 40 years of accumulated pain. Rosalie had raised 4 children and understood the peculiar loneliness of being taken for granted by the people you love most. "Eleanor," she said, stirring honey into her tea, "when did you last do something just for yourself? When did you last matter in your own life?" I couldn't answer because I couldn't remember. 2 days before Christmas, my phone buzzed with a text from Rebecca. "We'll be there tomorrow at noon. Can't wait to see what you've made this year. The kids are so excited for Grandma Eleanor's cooking." I stared at that message for a long time. There was no question mark, no acknowledgement of our previous conversation, no recognition that I'd explicitly said I wouldn't be cooking. It was an assumption wrapped in false cheer, a presumption that I would fall back into my old patterns because that's what I always did. I texted back, "I meant what I said. I'm not cooking this year." Her response came immediately. "LOL, Mom. Stop being dramatic. We'll see you tomorrow." That night, I couldn't sleep. I paced my small apartment, looking at the empty refrigerator, the silent stove, the table set for one. Part of me wanted to rush to the grocery store to spend my pension money on ingredients for meals I'd cook with resentful hands. The familiar weight of obligation pressed down on my shoulders like a winter coat I'd worn too long. But another part of me, a part that had been buried under decades of putting everyone else first, whispered, "What if you don't? What if, for once, you mean what you say?" Christmas Eve arrived gray and cold. I made myself a simple breakfast and sat by the window, watching my neighbors hurry past with arms full of last-minute gifts and groceries. Children squealed with excitement in the hallway outside my apartment. The building hummed with preparation and anticipation, but I felt detached from it all, like watching a movie of someone else's life. At 11:30 the next morning, I heard familiar voices in the hallway. My heart began to race. David's deep laugh, Rebecca's higher-pitched chatter, and the unmistakable sound of my 3 grandchildren arguing about something trivial. I looked around my apartment. No decorations, no feast awaiting them, no magical Christmas morning setup. Just me, in my everyday clothes, sitting at my small table with a cup of tea. The knock came precisely at noon. I opened the door to find my family standing there with the confidence of people who'd never doubted their welcome. David held a bottle of wine. Not expensive, probably picked up at the corner store. And Rebecca carried nothing but her purse and that smile she wore when she wanted something. "Merry Christmas, Mom," David said, kissing my cheek as he pushed past me into the apartment. "Something smells different in here. Did you try a new recipe?" "There's no food," I said quietly. Rebecca was already in the kitchen, opening cabinets with the familiarity of someone searching their own home. "Very funny, Eleanor. Where did you hide everything? In the oven? Oh, this is like a treasure hunt." My grandson Tommy, 8 years old and perpetually hungry, tugged on my sweater. "Grandma Eleanor, I'm starving. When do we eat?" I knelt down to his eye level. This beautiful child who looked so much like David at that age. "Tommy, Grandma didn't cook this year. I told your parents, but I don't think they believed me." Tommy's face scrunched in confusion. "But you always cook. That's what grandmas do." From the kitchen, Rebecca's voice carried a note of rising panic. "Eleanor, this isn't funny anymore. Where's the food? We have 3 hungry kids here, and my parents are coming over later to meet us. You said you were making your famous ham and all the sides." "I never said that," I replied, my voice growing stronger. "I specifically told you I wasn't cooking this year." David appeared in the doorway, his face flushed with embarrassment and anger. "Mom, you can't just spring this on us. We've been planning this for months. Rebecca told her whole family about your Christmas dinners. You're making us look like fools." The weight of their expectations pressed against my chest like a physical force. This was the moment I dreaded, not their disappointment, but their anger at discovering I was a real person with limits and needs, not just a kitchen appliance that produced meals on command. "I'm not trying to make anyone look foolish," I said. "I'm just tired. I've been cooking Christmas dinner for this family since before you were married, David. 43 years of Christmas mornings in that kitchen, and I can't do it anymore." Rebecca emerged from the kitchen, her carefully applied makeup beginning to crack around her eyes. "This is so selfish, Eleanor. Christmas is about family, about traditions. You're ruining it for the children." My granddaughter Sarah, 12 and beginning to understand adult dynamics, looked between us with worry creasing her young face. "Are you okay, Grandma? Are you sick?" I wasn't sick in the way she meant, but something inside me was dying, had been dying for years. It was the part of me that existed separately from my role as mother, grandmother, cook, cleaner, emergency babysitter, and financial safety net. The part that might have had dreams and interests beyond serving others. "I'm not sick, sweetheart," I told Sarah. "I'm just learning that it's okay to say no sometimes. What happened next will stay with me forever." Rebecca, faced with the reality that there would be no feast, no Instagram-worthy Christmas table, no easy solution to her hosting obligations, began to cry. Not sad tears, but furious ones. "Fine," she said, grabbing her coat. "Fine. We'll go to McDonald's for Christmas dinner. I hope you're happy, Eleanor. I hope sitting here alone was worth destroying Christmas for your own grandchildren." David stood frozen between his wife and his mother, clearly torn but ultimately choosing the path of least resistance. "Mom, maybe you could just throw something together? Even sandwiches? Rebecca's really stressed about her parents coming over." The request felt like a slap. Even now, even after I'd explicitly set a boundary, they wanted me to save them from the consequences of their assumptions. They wanted me to rescue them from the embarrassment of having to explain to Rebecca's parents why there was no dinner, why they hadn't planned alternatives, why they'd treated their family matriarch like a short-order cook. "No," I said, and the word felt powerful in my mouth. "No, I won't throw something together. I won't save you from this. You're adults. You figure it out." Rebecca's tears turned to rage. "You're a bitter old woman, Eleanor. No wonder you sit here alone. No wonder nobody wants to spend time with you unless there's something in it for them." The cruelty of her words hit me like a physical blow. But something strange happened. Instead of crumpling, instead of rushing to the kitchen to salvage the situation, I felt myself getting calmer, clearer. "You're right," I said quietly. "Nobody does want to spend time with me unless there's something in it for them. Thank you for finally saying it out loud." They left in a flurry of slammed doors and whispered arguments in the hallway. Tommy called back, "Bye, Grandma Eleanor," but the sound was quickly muffled as they dragged him away. I stood in my doorway until their voices faded down the stairwell, then closed the door and turned the deadbolt. The silence in my apartment was absolute. No Christmas music, No sizzling pans, no laughter or conversation. Just me and the gray morning light filtering through my blinds. I should have felt devastated. Instead, I felt something I couldn't immediately identify. It was peace. I made myself a grilled cheese sandwich and ate it slowly, tasting each bite. I put on my favorite classical music, Vivaldi's Four Seasons, and let it fill the empty spaces. I opened a book I'd been trying to finish for months and read uninterrupted for the first time in years. But around 3 o'clock, doubt crept in. Had I been too harsh? Had I destroyed something precious for the sake of making a point? I thought about Tommy's confused face, Sarah's worry, even David's helpless embarrassment. These were my people, my blood, my heart walking around outside my body. Maybe Rebecca was right. Maybe I was just a bitter old woman who'd let pride ruin Christmas. I was spiraling into guilt when my phone rang. Rosalie. Eleanor, honey, how did it go today? I told her everything. The empty-handed arrival, Rebecca's assumption that I'd been joking about not cooking, the ugly confrontation, the tears and accusations. Rosalie listened without judgment, occasionally making soft sounds of understanding. "And how do you feel now?" she asked when I finished. "Confused," I admitted. "Guilty. Maybe I should call them and apologize. Offer to cook something for tomorrow." "Eleanor," Rosalie said gently, "let me tell you something I learned when my own children were taking advantage of me. When you stop enabling people, they get angry. When you stop rescuing them, they call you selfish. When you stop putting their needs above your own, they accuse you of not loving them. Their reaction doesn't mean you're wrong. It means you're changing a dynamic they benefited from." Her words settled into my chest like warm honey. We talked for another hour, and by the time I hung up, the guilt had transformed into something else. A quiet determination to see this through. That evening, I did something I hadn't done in decades. I took a long, hot bath with lavender salts I'd been saving for a special occasion. I realized I'd been waiting for someone else to declare occasions special, when I could do it myself. I put on my softest pajamas and made myself hot chocolate with the good cocoa I usually reserved for guests. I went to bed early that night, expecting to lie awake replaying the day's drama. Instead, I slept more deeply than I had in months. No anxiety about tomorrow's meals. No mental lists of cleaning and preparation. No hypervigilance about everyone else's needs and moods. Just rest. The next morning brought a string of text messages from David. They started apologetic. "Mom, I'm sorry about yesterday." Rebecca was just disappointed, but quickly shifted to familiar manipulation tactics. "The kids keep asking why Grandma Eleanor was mad at them. Rebecca's parents think our family is falling apart. Can we try again for New Year's?" I didn't respond immediately. Instead, I got dressed and took a walk through my neighborhood. Queens in December can be beautiful if you notice it. Christmas lights twinkling in apartment windows, the smell of fresh bread from the bakery on Northern Boulevard, children building snowmen in pocket-sized yards. I'd lived here for 30 years but realized I'd been too busy serving others to really see my own community. At a small cafe I'd walked past hundreds of times but never entered, I ordered coffee and a pastry. The owner, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and flour-dusted aprons, struck up a conversation. Her name was Maria, and she'd been running this place for 15 years. She was working on Christmas because, she said, some people needed a warm place to go when family became too complicated. "I see you walking past sometimes," Maria said, refilling my coffee. "Always in a hurry, always carrying shopping bags. Today you look different. Peaceful." I found myself telling this stranger about my Christmas rebellion. Maria listened with the attention of someone who understood family dynamics intimately. When I finished, she nodded thoughtfully. "You know what I think?" Maria said. "I think you've been living your life on everyone else's terms for so long, you forgot you had a choice. My mother did the same thing, martyred herself for ungrateful children until she was nothing but resentment and exhaustion. It took my father's death for her to remember she was a person, not just a mother." "Do you think I'm being selfish?" I asked. Maria laughed, a warm sound that filled the empty cafe. "Eleanor, caring for yourself isn't selfish. It's necessary. You can't pour from an empty cup, and it sounds like you've been running on empty for years." I spent 3 hours in that cafe, longer than I'd spent on myself in decades. When I finally returned home, I felt fortified for whatever came next. What came next was Rebecca showing up at my door unannounced 3 days later, this time without David or the children. She looked different, less polished, more desperate. Her usual confidence had been replaced by something harder to read. "Eleanor, we need to talk," she said, pushing past me into the apartment without invitation. She'd done this countless times before, treating my home like an extension of her own. But this time it felt different. Invasive. "Would you like some tea?" I offered, falling back on decades of programmed hospitality. "I don't want tea. I want to understand what's happening to you." David is worried sick. The children are confused. My parents think we're having some kind of family breakdown. Rebecca paced my small living room like a caged animal. She was dressed casually, jeans and a sweater I'd never seen before, but her movements were sharp with barely controlled anger. This isn't like you, Eleanor. You've always been so giving, so selfless. Now suddenly you're acting like we're strangers, like we've done something terrible to deserve this treatment. I sat down at my kitchen table, the same spot where I'd made my original decision not to cook. What exactly do you think I've done to you, Rebecca? She spun to face me, her eyes bright with indignation. You embarrassed us. My parents drove 3 hours to meet us for Christmas dinner, expecting to experience your famous hospitality. Instead, we had to explain why we were eating takeout Chinese food from paper containers. They think David married into a dysfunctional family. The irony wasn't lost on me. Rebecca was worried about her parents' impression of our family's dysfunction, while simultaneously demonstrating exactly what that dysfunction looked like. But I didn't point this out. Instead, I asked a question that had been forming in my mind for days. Rebecca, when was the last time you asked me how I was doing? Not as it related to your needs, not about whether I could babysit or cook or help with something, just how I was doing as a person. She stopped pacing, clearly caught off guard by the question. We talk all the time. I always ask about your health when we see you. When do we see each other? I pressed gently. When you need something. When there's a holiday to host or children to watch, or when David needs money for car repairs. When was the last time you called just to chat? When was the last time you invited me to something instead of expecting me to provide something? Rebecca's face flushed red. That's not fair. We're busy. We have jobs and 3 children and a mortgage. We don't have time for social calls. But you have time to expect me to spend days preparing elaborate meals for people who don't even say thank you? The question hung in the air between us. Rebecca opened her mouth to argue, then seemed to realize she had no good answer. The silence stretched uncomfortably long. This is ridiculous, she finally said. You're being dramatic. We appreciate everything you do. Of course we do. When's the last time you told me that? Another long pause. Rebecca's anger was deflating into something that looked almost like panic. I realized that my steady questions were dismantling the narrative she'd constructed in her mind, the one where I was an unreasonable old woman having some kind of breakdown, and she was the innocent victim of my sudden selfishness. Eleanor, I don't know what you want from us. We love you. We include you in everything. The kids adore you. The kids adore my cooking, I corrected gently. They adore the presents I buy them and the free babysitting I provide. But do they know me at all? Do any of you know what I like to do when I'm not serving your family? Do you know what my dreams were before I became your emergency support system? Rebecca stared at me like I was speaking a foreign language. It occurred to me that this might be the longest conversation we'd ever had that wasn't about logistics. Who was bringing what to dinner? What time everyone would arrive? Whether I could watch the children next weekend? I'll tell you what I want, I continued, my voice growing stronger. I want to matter. I want to be seen as a person with my own needs and limitations. I want someone in this family to call me just because they miss talking to me. Not because they need something. I want to be invited places instead of always being expected to host. I want to receive the kind of thoughtfulness I've been giving for decades. Rebecca's composure finally cracked. This is about money, isn't it? You're mad that we haven't paid you back for the down payment on the house. Fine, we'll set up a payment plan. The fact that she thought this was about money showed me how little she understood what was happening. This isn't about money, Rebecca. This is about respect. This is about being treated like family instead of hired help. You're being unreasonable, she snapped, her patience finally exhausted. Family helps family. That's what love is. If you can't see that we love you, that's your problem, not ours. After she left, slamming my door hard enough to rattle the pictures on the wall, I sat in the silence she'd shattered. The conversation had confirmed what I'd suspected but didn't want to believe. They genuinely saw nothing wrong with the dynamic we'd established. In their minds, my role was to give, and their role was to receive. Any deviation from this pattern wasn't seen as healthy boundary setting, but as a betrayal of my function in their lives. That evening, I did something I'd never done before. I called David directly, bypassing Rebecca entirely. Mom, is everything okay? Rebecca said you two had a fight. We had a conversation, I corrected. David, I need you to hear something important. I love you more than my own life, but I can't continue being treated like a service provider in this family. I need to be valued for who I am, not just for what I can do for everyone. David was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was careful, diplomatic. Mom, nobody treats you like a service provider. You're the matriarch of this family. We all look up to you. When's the last time you called me just to say hello? The same silence that had greeted this question from Rebecca. David, I raised you to be better than this. I taught you to say please and thank you, to consider other people's feelings, to appreciate the people who love you. Somewhere along the way, you forgot to apply those lessons to your relationship with me. Mom, that's not... We do appreciate you. Maybe we don't say it enough, but you know we love you. Love isn't just a feeling, David. It's actions. It's consideration. It's caring about someone's well-being beyond what they can provide for you. Another long pause. I could hear children's voices in the background. My grandchildren, living their lives while the adults navigated this grown-up heartbreak. What do you want from us? David asked, echoing his wife's question from earlier. I want you to think about that question, I said. I want you to really think about what it means that you don't know what would make me happy beyond continuing to serve your family without complaint. I hung up feeling emotionally wrung out, but clearer than I'd felt in years. The hardest part wasn't their anger or confusion. It was the growing certainty that they might never understand what I was trying to tell them. They might genuinely be incapable of seeing me as anything other than a supporting character in their lives. That night, I couldn't sleep. Not from anxiety this time, but from a strange kind of energy. I felt like I was waking up from a long dream where I'd forgotten who I was outside of my roles as mother and grandmother. I started making mental lists, not of things I needed to do for other people, but of things I might want to do for myself. When had I stopped having my own interests? When had my entire identity become wrapped up in anticipating and meeting other people's needs? I remembered being young, having dreams that had nothing to do with anyone else's happiness. I'd wanted to travel, to take art classes, to read books that weren't about parenting or cooking. I'd had friends who weren't just other mothers comparing child-rearing strategies. Over the next week, something remarkable happened. Without the constant undercurrent of family obligations, without the mental energy devoted to managing everyone else's emotions and logistics, I began to remember myself. I signed up for a watercolor painting class at the community college. I joined the library's book club. I struck up conversations with neighbors I'd been too busy to really talk to for years. Most surprisingly, I started sleeping better. The chronic anxiety that had been my constant companion for decades began to ease. I realized I'd been living in a state of perpetual alertness, always anticipating the next request, the next crisis, the next opportunity to prove my worth through service. But my newfound peace was interrupted by a phone call that changed everything. It was 11 o'clock on a Tuesday night when my phone rang. The caller ID showed David's number, and my heart immediately started racing. Late-night calls meant emergencies, sick children, financial crises, relationship problems. All the fears that parenthood had programmed into my nervous system came flooding back. Mom? David's voice was strained, exhausted. I'm sorry to call so late. We're at the hospital. Tommy fell off his bike and broke his wrist. Rebecca's with him now, but we're going to be here all night, and Sarah and the baby are at home with a sitter who needs to leave by midnight. Without thinking, I was already reaching for my coat. I'll be right there. Which hospital? Mom, wait, We can't ask you to do this, not after everything that's happened. Rebecca said we need to handle our own problems. The pain in his voice stopped me cold. My grandson was hurt, my son was scared, and they felt like they couldn't ask for help because we'd been fighting about boundaries and respect. This wasn't what I'd wanted at all. David, Tommy is my grandson. Family emergencies are different from expecting me to cook Christmas dinner. Give me the address for the sitter. Are you sure? We know you're mad at us. I'm not mad at you, I said, surprised to realize it was true. I'm disappointed in how I've been treated, but I will always show up when my family really needs me. The difference is, now I expect the same consideration in return. I spent that night at David and Rebecca's house, rocking their youngest daughter when she woke up crying, making breakfast for Sarah before school, and being present in the way that truly mattered. When David and Rebecca returned the next morning, exhausted but relieved that Tommy would be fine, something between us had shifted. Rebecca looked at me with new eyes. Eleanor, thank you. I don't know what we would have done without you. This is what family does, I said. We show up for real emergencies, real needs. But Rebecca, this can't be the only time you appreciate me. I can't go back to being invisible until the next crisis. For the first time since I'd known her, Rebecca looked genuinely ashamed. I think I understand now. At least I'm starting to. Over the following months, our relationship didn't magically transform, but it began to evolve. The changes were small at first. Rebecca started calling occasionally just to chat, not to ask for anything. David began checking in on me regularly, asking about my painting classes and book club. The children, picking up on the adults' new dynamic, started sharing more of themselves with me beyond just expectations for entertainment and gifts. The most significant change was in how I saw myself. I'd spent so many years defining my worth through my usefulness to others that I'd forgotten I had inherent value. The woman who signed up for painting classes, who joined a book club, who struck up friendships with neighbors. This woman had always existed inside me, buried under decades of self-sacrifice. But the real test of our family's transformation came 6 months later, when Rebecca called with an unusual request. "Eleanor, I hope this doesn't sound weird, but would you like to go to lunch? Just us. Not because we need anything, just because I realized I don't really know you that well. Not outside of family stuff." We met at a little restaurant in Flushing, and for the first time, we talked as two women instead of as antagonists in a family drama. Rebecca told me about her childhood, her fears about motherhood, her struggles to balance career and family. She asked about my life before marriage, my abandoned dreams, what made me happy now. It wasn't a perfect conversation. Years of resentment don't disappear over sandwiches and soup, but it was a beginning. "Eleanor," Rebecca said as we prepared to leave, "I owe you an apology, not just for Christmas, but for years of taking you for granted. I grew up in a family where the women served and the men and children took, and I never questioned whether that was fair or healthy. I taught my children to see you the same way I saw my own grandmother, as someone whose job was to love and give without expecting anything in return." Her honesty surprised me. "What changed your mind?" "Watching you these past months, seeing you develop interests and friendships that had nothing to do with us, realizing that you're a whole person with your own life, not just our family auxiliary. And honestly, seeing how much happier you look now that you're not constantly stressed about everyone else's needs." That summer, something unprecedented happened. Rebecca and David invited me to join them for a week at a lake house they'd rented. Not to cook or babysit, but just to be included. They planned the meals, handled the children's needs, and treated me like a guest in the best possible way. I spent mornings painting watercolors by the lake while the family slept in. I read books on the dock while the children played in the shallow water nearby. For the first time in decades, I experienced what it felt like to be cared for, instead of always being the caregiver. On our last evening there, Tommy approached me as I sat watching the sunset. He was 9 now, older and more thoughtful than the confused child who'd asked why Grandma Eleanor was angry that Christmas day. "Grandma," he said, settling beside me on the dock, "I'm sorry we made you sad before." "You didn't make me sad, sweetheart. The grown-ups were just learning how to treat each other better. Mom explained it to us," Tommy continued. "She said we were being selfish and not thinking about your feelings. That's not how family should be." I pulled him closer. This precious boy who was learning lessons about respect and consideration that might serve him well in his own future relationships. "No, it's not. But the important thing is that everyone is trying to do better now." The following Christmas was different in every way that mattered. We celebrated at David and Rebecca's house. Their suggestion, not my assumption of responsibility. I brought one dish that I genuinely wanted to make, not an entire feast prepared under pressure and stress. The children had made me handmade gifts and cards that showed they'd been thinking about things I enjoyed, not just things I could provide. Most importantly, I felt like a cherished guest rather than unpaid staff. When Rebecca started to stress about the timing of the turkey, David gently reminded her that they could order takeout if needed. The point was being together, not proving anything through elaborate meals. After dinner, as we sat around their living room sharing stories and playing with the children, Rebecca presented me with an unexpected gift. It was a photo album she'd created, filled with pictures of me through the years, but she'd written different captions than I might have expected. Instead of "Eleanor cooking Christmas dinner" or "Eleanor babysitting," the captions read things like "Eleanor sharing her love through food" and "Eleanor teaching patience and kindness." "I wanted you to see yourself the way we're learning to see you," Rebecca explained. "Not as someone who does things for us, but as someone who chooses to love us in all these different ways." The last page of the album was blank except for one line. "Eleanor's new adventures begin here." As I write this today, 2 years after that first Christmas rebellion, my life looks completely different. I still love my family deeply, but I love myself too. I've traveled to places I'd only dreamed about. A painting workshop in Vermont. A book lover's tour of historic libraries in New England. I've developed friendships with people who knew nothing about my family history, who appreciated me for my opinions on books and art and the wider world. My relationship with David and Rebecca continues to evolve. There are still moments when old patterns try to reassert themselves, when they unconsciously slip back into expecting, rather than asking, taking rather than reciprocating. But now we all recognize these moments and correct course more quickly. The children, now 11, 14, and 7, have grown up watching me become more fully myself. They see their grandmother as someone with her own interests and opinions, not just as a source of comfort and cookies. I think this has been good for them, learning early that the women in their lives are complete people with their own dreams and boundaries. Rosalie, my neighbor who first encouraged me to value myself, has become one of my closest friends. We attend book club together, take painting classes, and support each other through the ongoing challenges of being older women who refuse to become invisible. Sometimes people ask me if I regret that difficult Christmas, if I wish I'd handled things differently. The answer is complicated. I regret the pain it caused, the confusion it created for my grandchildren, the temporary fracture it created in family relationships that had taken decades to build. But I don't regret claiming my worth. I don't regret insisting on respect. I don't regret discovering that I could survive being disliked by people whose approval I'd spent decades seeking. Most of all, I don't regret learning that love and service aren't the same thing, that caring for others doesn't require erasing yourself. The most profound change has been in how I think about legacy. For years, I thought my legacy would be the memories of holiday meals, the family traditions I'd maintained, the sacrifices I'd made to keep everyone happy. Now I realize my true legacy might be showing my children and grandchildren what it looks like for a woman to value herself, to set boundaries with love, to insist on reciprocal relationships even within families. I think about the example I was setting during all those years of silent martyrdom. I was teaching the children that women exist to serve, that love means never saying no, that grandmother-shaped people don't have needs or dreams of their own. By breaking that pattern, by insisting on my own humanity, I may have given them a better model for their own future relationships. My apartment is different now, too. It's still small, still in the same Queens neighborhood I've called home for 30 years. But it's filled with paintings I've created, books I've chosen for myself, photographs from trips I've taken. The kitchen that once felt like a prison now feels like one part of a fuller life. I still cook sometimes, when I want to, for people who appreciate it, as an expression of love rather than an obligation. The difference is enormous. Food prepared with joy tastes different than food prepared under duress. Hospitality offered freely feels different than service extracted through expectation. On quiet evenings, I sometimes think about all the women my age who might be reading this story, recognizing themselves in my old patterns of self-denial and endless giving. How many grandmothers are exhausting themselves trying to buy love through service? How many mothers have forgotten that they exist separate from their children's needs? The path I took wasn't easy. Setting boundaries with people you love, especially when they resist those boundaries, requires enormous courage. There were moments when I wondered if I was destroying something precious for the sake of pride. There were lonely days when I questioned whether being right was worth being isolated. But isolation and solitude are different things. Isolation is being surrounded by people who don't see you. Solitude is being alone with someone you've learned to appreciate, yourself. I discovered that I actually enjoy my own company, something I'd never had the opportunity to learn during all those decades of constant availability to others. The financial aspect of my transformation has been significant too. For years, I'd been draining my pension and Social Security to supplement David and Rebecca's lifestyle, helping with mortgage payments during tight months, paying for the children's activities and summer camps, always finding ways to ease their financial pressure at the expense of my own security. When I stopped being their emergency ATM, I could finally build some savings for myself. I opened an investment account with money I'd previously been giving away, putting it into steady stocks and even a small amount in Bitcoin that my banker recommended. Watching my own wealth grow instead of constantly flowing out to ungrateful recipients gave me a sense of security I hadn't felt in years. This wasn't about being selfish with money. It was about recognizing that my financial stability mattered too. During emergencies like Tommy's hospital visit, I was still able to help because I'd preserved resources for genuine need, rather than constantly subsidizing their lifestyle choices. The money conversation was one of the most difficult aspects of our family transformation. When I stopped the regular transfers that had been supplementing their income for years, David and Rebecca had to make some hard choices about their spending. They downsized some expenses, picked up additional work hours, and learned to distinguish between wants and needs. Initially, this caused resentment. There were comments about how I was hoarding money while they struggled, but over time, they began to appreciate their increased financial independence. Rebecca even thanked me eventually, saying that learning to manage completely on their own income had made them stronger as a couple and more grateful for what they had. I've learned to use my resources to enhance my own life in ways I'd never considered before. The painting classes, the small trips, the ability to buy books without guilt, these might seem minor, but they represent a fundamental shift in how I value my own happiness. The investment returns have been modest but steady, and knowing that my money is working for me rather than disappearing into someone else's budget feels revolutionary. Have I made mistakes along the way? Absolutely. There were times when I overcorrected, when I said no to things I might have reasonably helped with because I was still learning where healthy boundaries should be drawn. There were moments when my hurt feelings made me less generous than I wanted to be, when I held grudges longer than was productive. The learning process has been ongoing. Each situation requires its own evaluation. Is this request coming from genuine need or from entitlement? Am I being asked or am I being expected to comply? Is this something I can do with joy or something I would do with resentment? Rebecca and I had another difficult conversation last spring that illustrates how complex this balance can be. She called asking if I could watch the children for a weekend while she and David attended a wedding. My first instinct was to say no automatically, still protective of my newfound independence. But then I realized this was exactly the kind of request that loving families make of each other. Reasonable, advance notice, genuine need rather than assumption. I'd be happy to watch them, I told her. But I need you to understand that this is me choosing to help, not me fulfilling an obligation. What's the difference? She asked, genuinely curious rather than defensive. The difference is that when I choose to help, I do it with love and pleasure instead of resentment. When I feel obligated, it builds anger that eventually hurts everyone. That weekend with my grandchildren was delightful because I'd entered it freely. They sensed the difference too. Instead of interacting with a stressed, overcommitted grandmother, they experienced someone who was genuinely happy to spend time with them. These days, when people ask me about that famous Christmas when I refused to cook, I tell them it wasn't really about the food. It was about recognition, respect, and the right to exist as a complete person within my own family. The turkey and stuffing were just symbols of a much larger issue. I think about my grandmother sometimes, and my mother, both of whom lived their entire lives in service to their families without ever demanding reciprocal consideration. They died having been beloved, certainly, but also having been taken for granted in ways that diminished their humanity. I wonder what their lives might have looked like if they'd had the courage, or the social permission, to insist on their own worth. The generational patterns in families run deep. The women in my family were raised to be grateful for the opportunity to sacrifice for others. We were taught that selflessness was a virtue and that our needs were inherently less important than everyone else's comfort. Breaking these patterns required not just individual courage, but a willingness to disappoint people whose approval I'd spent decades seeking. Would I handle things exactly the same way if I could do it over? Probably not. I might have tried more direct conversations earlier, before the resentment had built to explosive levels. I might have set smaller boundaries gradually instead of making such a dramatic stand, but I also might not have had the courage to change anything without the crisis that Christmas created. Sometimes change requires dramatic disruption. Sometimes we have to risk losing relationships in order to save them. The family I have now, based on mutual respect and genuine appreciation, is healthier and more sustainable than the family I had before, which was built on unequal exchange and unexamined assumptions. As I sit here in my apartment this evening, looking at the paintings I've created and the photos from trips I've taken, I feel something I couldn't have imagined 3 years ago. I feel proud of my life, not just proud of what I've done for others, but proud of who I've become as an individual person. The woman who was invisible in her own family story has become the protagonist of her own life. The woman who measured her worth through service has learned to value herself for who she is, not just what she provides. The woman who was afraid of disappointing others has learned that sometimes disappointment is the price of authenticity. My calendar these days includes things I choose to do because they bring me joy. Book club meetings, painting classes, coffee dates with friends, small adventures around the city I've lived in but never fully explored. When family requests come in, I evaluate them based on my capacity for joyful generosity rather than automatic compliance. The children call me more often now, and the conversations are richer. They tell me about school and friends and their own dreams. I tell them about books I'm reading and places I want to visit. We know each other as people, not just as grandmother and grandchildren locked in traditional roles. David has become more thoughtful in how he communicates with me, more likely to ask about my week before mentioning anything he needs. Rebecca sends me articles she thinks I'd find interesting, including me in conversations that have nothing to do with family logistics. These small changes represent a fundamental shift in how they see me. But perhaps the most important change is how I see myself. I wake up each morning with a sense of possibility rather than obligation. I make choices based on my own preferences rather than other people's expectations. I've remembered what it feels like to matter in my own life. The story of that Christmas when I refused to cook has become family legend now, but the meaning has evolved. It's no longer the story of when Grandma Eleanor had a breakdown and ruined Christmas. It's become the story of when our family learned to love each other better, when we discovered that respect and appreciation make love stronger, not weaker. Last week, Tommy, now 11, was working on a school project about family heroes. He asked to interview me, and his questions surprised me with their thoughtfulness. "Grandma Eleanor," he said, "Mom told us that you had to teach our family how to treat you better. How did you find the courage to do that? I thought about his question for a long time before answering. Tommy, I think courage isn't something you find. It's something you build little by little, every time you choose what's right over what's easy. For a long time, it was easier for me to just keep giving everyone what they wanted instead of asking for what I needed. But eventually, easy became impossible, and that's when I had to be brave. Are you glad you did it? Even though it made everyone upset for a while? Yes, sweetheart. I'm glad because now when you spend time with me, I know it's because you want to, not because you need something. And when I help your family, I know it's because I'm choosing to love you, not because I'm afraid you won't love me if I don't. Tommy nodded seriously, writing notes in his careful 11-year-old handwriting. I want to remember that for when I'm grown up. That love should make people happy, not tired. Out of the mouths of children. He'd captured in one sentence what it took me 67 years to learn. These days, when I tell this story to friends or acquaintances who find themselves in similar situations, I'm careful to acknowledge that not every family is capable of growth. Some people are so entrenched in patterns of taking advantage that they'll never appreciate sacrifice, no matter how dramatically it's withdrawn. Sometimes setting boundaries means accepting that certain relationships will end. I was fortunate that my family, despite their initial resistance and anger, was ultimately capable of change. David and Rebecca were able to recognize their behavior patterns and make different choices. The children were young enough to adapt to new family dynamics without too much confusion. Not everyone who tries to transform these patterns will have the same outcome, but even if my family had been unable or unwilling to treat me better, I would still have been better off for insisting on my worth. The peace I found in that first quiet Christmas day, when I finally stopped trying to earn love through exhaustion, was valuable regardless of how others responded to it. There's something to be said for the radical act of treating yourself well, even if you have to do it alone. There's dignity in refusing to participate in your own diminishment, even if other people don't understand or support your choice. For anyone listening to this story who recognizes themselves in my old patterns, I want you to know that it's never too late to insist on your own humanity. It's never too late to stop buying love with service, to stop accepting crumbs of appreciation for banquets of generosity. You deserve to be valued for who you are, not just for what you can provide. The courage you need to make these changes doesn't have to appear all at once. You can build it gradually, starting with small boundaries and working your way up to bigger ones. You can practice saying no to minor requests before you tackle the major expectations. You can begin treating yourself with the consideration you've been giving everyone else. Most importantly, you can remember that you are allowed to matter in your own life. You're allowed to have needs, preferences, and limits. You're allowed to be tired, to say no, to prioritize your own well-being without guilt or apology. The woman I am today, painting watercolors by her apartment window, planning a trip to see fall foliage in New England, looking forward to book club discussions. This woman was always inside me, waiting for permission to exist. I gave myself that permission when I refused to cook that Christmas, and everything that's followed has been an expression of that fundamental choice to matter. As evening falls here in Queens, as the sounds of families sharing dinner drift through my windows, I feel nothing but gratitude for the journey that brought me to this place of peace. The crisis that felt like an ending was actually a beginning. The family relationships that seemed to break have become stronger after healing. The woman who felt invisible has learned to shine in her own life. But let me tell you about what happened just last month, because this story isn't finished yet. It never really finishes. It just keeps evolving, like all real relationships do. Sarah, my oldest granddaughter, is now 15 and becoming the kind of thoughtful, independent young woman that fills my heart with hope. She came to visit me on a Saturday afternoon, not because her parents sent her or because she needed anything, but because she genuinely wanted to spend time with me. We sat in my kitchen, the same kitchen where I'd made my stand 3 years ago, and she asked me questions that showed how much she'd been thinking about the transformation our family had gone through. "Grandma Eleanor," she said, carefully choosing her words. "I was too young to really understand what happened that Christmas, but now I think I get it. You weren't trying to hurt us. You were trying to save yourself." Her insight took my breath away. At 15, she understood something that had taken the adults in our family months to grasp. "That's exactly right, sweetheart. Sometimes saving yourself is the only way to save your relationships, too." "I hope I remember that when I'm older," Sarah said. "Mom talks about it sometimes now, how she grew up thinking that being a good wife and mother meant disappearing into what everyone else needed. She said she doesn't want me to make the same mistakes." This conversation gave me more hope than all the apologies and changed behaviors combined, because it meant that the lessons of my rebellion were being passed down to a new generation. Sarah would grow up knowing that women have the right to boundaries, that love doesn't require self-erasure, that service should be chosen rather than extracted. A few weeks later, I received a call that tested all of our family's growth in a new way. Rebecca was pregnant again, unexpectedly, at 39, with their fourth child. She was scared about the finances, the logistics, the impact on their already stretched resources. But when she called to tell me, she didn't ask for anything. She didn't assume I would step in to solve their problems. She just shared her feelings and asked if I might want to be part of supporting them through a challenging time. "Eleanor," she said, "I know we can't expect you to take care of everything like before, but if you'd be willing to help sometimes in ways that work for you, we'd be grateful. And if this is too much for you right now, we understand. We'll figure it out either way." The difference in how she approached me was remarkable. Instead of assuming my availability, she acknowledged my autonomy. Instead of expecting specific types of help, she opened the door for me to choose how I might contribute. Instead of manipulating through guilt, she respected my right to say no. I thought about it for several days before responding. Did I want to take on the role of grandmother to a fourth child? Did I have the energy, the interest, the capacity for joy in that situation? Or would it drag me back into patterns of obligatory service that I'd worked so hard to escape? What I realized was that the very fact that I could ask these questions honestly, without automatic guilt, meant that whatever I decided would come from a healthy place. I wasn't being pressured into compliance or manipulated through family expectations. I was genuinely free to choose. I called Rebecca back and told her I'd love to be involved with the new baby, but in ways that suited my current life rather than my old patterns. I wouldn't provide regular childcare or financial support, but I might occasionally babysit when asked politely and given adequate notice. I wouldn't take over meal preparation after the birth, but I might bring food sometimes when I felt moved to do so. I wouldn't serve as an emergency contact or backup plan for their parenting needs, but I would celebrate this child and love them fully as their grandmother. "That sounds perfect," Rebecca said, and I could hear genuine relief in her voice rather than disappointment. She'd grown too. She was learning to prefer authentic, sustainable relationships over the exhausting dynamics we'd maintained for so many years. When little Gabriel was born 6 months ago, I experienced grandmotherhood in a completely different way than I had with the older children. Instead of feeling immediately responsible for his care and his parents' well-being, I felt pure joy in his existence. I could hold him and coo over him and buy him tiny outfits without any sense of obligation weighing down the experience. The afternoon I first met Gabriel, I sat in the hospital room watching David and Rebecca navigate the exhaustion and wonder of new parenthood, while their older children crowded around the baby with excitement. For a moment, my old patterns kicked in. I started mentally planning meals I could prepare, organizing childcare schedules, figuring out how I could make their transition easier. But then I caught myself and made a conscious choice to simply be present without trying to fix or manage anything. I held my newest grandson and marveled at his tiny fingers, and the way light fell across his sleeping face. I listened to Tommy and Sarah and their middle sister Emma share their hopes for their baby brother without immediately jumping into planning mode. When David asked if I might be able to help them during their first week home, I surprised myself by saying, "Let me think about it and get back to you tomorrow." The old Eleanor would have immediately said yes, while simultaneously resenting the assumption. The new Eleanor took time to consider what she could genuinely offer with joy. I ended up spending 2 afternoons that week at their house, not managing or organizing or cooking elaborate meals, but simply being an extra pair of hands and a source of calm presence. I folded laundry while Rebecca napped, read stories to the older children while David handled baby care, and made simple sandwiches when everyone was too tired to think about dinner. The difference was that every moment felt chosen rather than obligated. When I left each evening, I felt energized rather than drained. When they thanked me, it felt like genuine appreciation rather than perfunctory acknowledgement of free labor. This experience with Gabriel's arrival showed me how much our entire family dynamic had changed. The children were more helpful and less demanding. David and Rebecca had realistic expectations and expressed genuine gratitude. Most importantly, I was able to contribute from a place of abundance rather than depletion. But perhaps the most significant development has been my growing friendship with other women who've made similar journeys. Through my book club and painting classes, I've met several women in their 60s and 70s who've had their own moments of refusing to cook the turkey, metaphorically speaking. There's Janet, who stopped hosting her large extended family's Easter celebration after 40 years of single-handedly managing every detail while her siblings showed up empty-handed. There's Carmen, who told her adult children they needed to find alternative childcare solutions instead of treating her as an always-available babysitter. There's Linda, who moved to a retirement community despite her daughter's protests that she was abandoning the family. We've become a sort of informal support group for women who've chosen themselves without apology. We share stories about the pushback we've received, the guilt we've had to overcome, and the freedom we've discovered. We celebrate each other's small victories, saying no to an unreasonable request, booking a trip without consulting anyone else's schedule, spending money on ourselves without justification. These friendships have been crucial to maintaining the changes I've made. When family pressure threatens to pull me back into old patterns, I have women who understand why boundaries matter. When I doubt whether I'm being too harsh or selfish, I have perspective from others who've walked similar paths. When I worry that I'm damaging relationships by insisting on respect, I have examples of families that have grown stronger through honest confrontation. One evening last month, our informal group was having coffee after book club when Carmen shared that her son had finally thanked her for forcing him to handle his own childcare needs. He said it made him a better father, she told us with tears in her eyes. He said it made him appreciate his wife more and understand what parenting actually requires instead of just assuming someone else would handle the hard parts. These are the victories we celebrate, not dramatic confrontations or punishment of ungrateful family members, but the slow, steady growth of healthier relationships built on mutual respect rather than one-sided sacrifice. I've been thinking lately about what I want the rest of my life to look like. At 69 now, I'm acutely aware that I have fewer years ahead of me than behind me. But instead of filling me with urgency to reconcile with anyone or accept any treatment for the sake of family peace, this awareness has deepened my commitment to living authentically. I want to spend my remaining years continuing to grow as a person, not just as a mother and grandmother. I want to travel more, paint more, read more books that challenge my thinking. I want to nurture friendships with people who see me as a complete individual rather than a service provider. I want to continue modeling for my grandchildren what it looks like to value yourself appropriately. I also want to document my experience more thoroughly. I've started writing a longer memoir about this transformation, not just the dramatic Christmas confrontation, but the entire journey of reclaiming myself. I think there might be value in sharing the detailed process, the small daily choices, the internal work, the practical strategies for maintaining boundaries while preserving loving relationships. Several people have suggested I start a blog or write a self-help book about setting boundaries with family members. While I'm not sure I'm qualified to give advice to others, I do think there's power in storytelling. When we share our experiences honestly, we give other people permission to examine their own patterns and consider their own options. The writing process has been revelatory in itself. Looking back at the woman I was 3 years ago, exhausted, resentful, invisible in my own life, I feel both compassion for her struggles and amazement at her strength. She survived decades of emotional neglect while continuing to pour love and service into relationships that weren't reciprocating appropriately. That took enormous resilience, even if it wasn't sustainable. I've also been thinking about the broader cultural patterns that made my situation so common. How many women of my generation were raised to believe that their worth was entirely tied to their service to others? How many of us were taught that love required complete self-sacrifice? How many of us reached older age having never learned to value our own needs and preferences? The women's liberation movement was happening during my young adulthood, but somehow its messages about equality and self-worth didn't fully penetrate my understanding of family relationships. I fought for workplace equality and political representation, while simultaneously accepting emotional inequality in my most intimate relationships. I demanded respect from strangers while tolerating disrespect from the people I loved most. This contradiction isn't unusual for women of my generation. We were caught between old expectations and new possibilities, often trying to have careers while maintaining traditional domestic roles, fighting for equality in public while accepting inequality at home. Many of us ended up carrying double burdens instead of achieving true liberation. But it's never too late to apply feminist principles to family relationships. It's never too late to insist that love should be mutual, that care should be reciprocated, that respect should flow in all directions. The personal is still political, especially when it comes to how women are valued within their own families. I've been corresponding with a woman named Patricia who read an earlier version of this story online. She's in her early 60s and facing her own crisis with adult children who expect her to provide extensive financial support and childcare while giving nothing meaningful back to her. Her situation is even more extreme than mine was. Her daughter actually moved back into Patricia's home with 2 children after a divorce, expecting free housing, childcare, and financial support, while contributing nothing and showing no gratitude. Patricia wrote to me, "I feel like I'm drowning in my own house. I work full-time to support 4 people, come home to cook and clean and do childcare, and get criticized if I ask for any help or recognition. My daughter treats me like I'm selfish if I want to watch my own TV shows or have friends over. I love my grandchildren, but I never signed up to raise them while their mother dates and parties." Her story breaks my heart because I see my former self in her desperation. I also see how much more extreme these patterns can become when they're not addressed early. Patricia's daughter never learned appropriate boundaries because Patricia never enforced any. Now the daughter is in her 30s, treating her mother like a service provider while expecting ongoing support without reciprocation. I've been encouraging Patricia to start with small boundaries, requiring her daughter to contribute financially to household expenses, insisting on designated personal time that can't be interrupted except for emergencies, asking for help with household tasks instead of doing everything herself. But I also understand how difficult this is when patterns are deeply entrenched and when grandchildren are involved. The complexity of these situations can't be overstated. When adult children use access to grandchildren as leverage, when financial circumstances make it difficult for older women to maintain independence, when cultural expectations pressure women to accommodate family needs above their own well-being, these factors can make boundary setting feel impossible. But I've learned that impossible and difficult are different things. What felt impossible to me 3 years ago was actually just more difficult than I'd been willing to attempt. The courage to face family anger, the strength to tolerate guilt and uncertainty, the faith that healthier relationships were worth the risk, these were muscles I had to develop through practice. Sometimes people ask me if I think my approach would work for everyone. The honest answer is no. Some families are too damaged, some individuals too resistant to change, some circumstances too complicated for the kind of transformation my family experienced. But I do think most situations contain more possibilities than the people in them realize. The key insight for me was recognizing that I had more power than I thought I did. I'd been operating from a position of assumed powerlessness, believing that I had to accept whatever treatment my family doled out, that saying no would result in complete rejection, that my role was to accommodate rather than negotiate. When I finally tested these assumptions, I discovered they weren't as solid as I'd believed. Yes, setting boundaries caused conflict and discomfort, but it didn't destroy my family. Yes, insisting on respect initially caused anger and pushback, but ultimately it led to deeper love and appreciation. The willingness to risk disapproval turned out to be the secret to earning genuine respect. The courage to prioritize my own well-being turned out to be essential for everyone's well-being. The strength to say no turned out to be the foundation for meaningful yeses. As I finish writing this extended account of my journey, I'm sitting in my apartment on a Sunday evening in early spring. Outside my window, the neighborhood is coming alive after a long winter. Children playing in the small yards, neighbors chatting on stoops, the promise of renewal in the air. I've just gotten off the phone with Sarah, my granddaughter, who called to tell me about a difficult situation with friends at school. She wanted my advice about setting boundaries with someone who was taking advantage of her kindness, a 15-year-old facing the same fundamental challenge that took me 67 years to address. The thing is, Grandma, she said, I know I need to speak up for myself, but I'm worried she'll get mad and not want to be friends anymore. Sarah, I told her, anyone who stops being your friend because you ask to be treated with respect wasn't really your friend to begin with. Real friends want you to advocate for yourself. They want you to have boundaries because they care about your well-being. Is that what happened with our family? We weren't really loving you until you made us start treating you better? Her question stopped me cold because it was so perceptive. We were loving each other, I said slowly, but not in healthy ways. Love without respect isn't really love. It's need and habit and fear wrapped up in familiar patterns. When we learned to respect each other, our love became stronger and more real. After we hung up, I sat thinking about how different her life might be because she's learning these lessons at 15 instead of 67. She's growing up watching women in her life insist on their own worth. She's seeing examples of boundaries that strengthen rather than damage relationships. She's learning that love and service aren't synonymous, that care should be mutual, that her needs matter as much as anyone else's. This might be the most important legacy of my Christmas rebellion, not the immediate changes in my family dynamics, but the long-term impact on how the next generation understands love and relationships. My grandchildren are growing up with different models, different expectations, different possibilities for how families can function. Tommy, now 12, recently told his parents he needed more time for his own interests and couldn't be available for as much babysitting of baby Gabriel as they'd been expecting. Instead of dismissing his boundaries, David and Rebecca recognized his right to his own time and found alternative solutions. They're applying the lessons they learned from me to their relationships with their own children. Emma, now 10, has started expressing preferences about family activities, instead of just going along with whatever adults decide. When Rebecca automatically signed her up for dance classes without asking, Emma spoke up and said she'd rather try art lessons. Instead of overruling her or calling her ungrateful, Rebecca apologized and asked Emma what activities actually interested her. These small changes demonstrate a fundamental shift in how our family understands individual autonomy. Children are learning that their preferences matter, that they can speak up for themselves, that love includes respect for personal boundaries. They're also learning that adults need boundaries too, that everyone deserves consideration, that relationships work best when everyone's needs are acknowledged. I think about my own childhood sometimes, about the messages I received about women's roles and the importance of selflessness. My mother never spoke up for herself, never demanded respect or consideration, never modeled self-advocacy. She was beloved for her constant giving, but she was also largely invisible as an individual person with her own interests and needs. I followed her example for decades, believing that good mothers and grandmothers existed primarily to serve others. I confused martyrdom with love, exhaustion with virtue, invisibility with humility. It took a crisis to wake me up to the damage these patterns were causing, not just to me, but to my entire family. Breaking generational cycles is one of the most challenging and important things we can do. It requires recognizing patterns that feel normal because they're familiar, questioning assumptions that have guided our choices for decades, and having the courage to try different approaches even when they feel scary or wrong. The resistance I encountered when I started setting boundaries wasn't just about individuals wanting to maintain their privileges. It was about an entire system of family functioning that depended on my continued self-sacrifice. When I changed my role, everyone else had to change theirs too. That's why the pushback was so intense. I wasn't just asking for different treatment, I was demanding a different kind of family. But families, like all systems, are capable of evolution. They can learn new patterns, develop healthier dynamics, and find better ways of loving each other. The key is that someone has to be willing to initiate change, even when it's uncomfortable and uncertain. For women especially, this often means developing muscles we've never been encouraged to build. The ability to prioritize ourselves, to tolerate other people's disappointment, to insist on reciprocity in relationships, to value our own needs as much as we value everyone else's. These skills don't develop overnight. They require practice, support, and often professional guidance. I was fortunate to have Rosalie as a neighbor and mentor, plus the eventual willingness of my family to grow and change. Not everyone has these advantages, but that doesn't mean change is impossible. There are resources available now that weren't easily accessible when I was going through my transformation. Online support groups for adult children dealing with family dysfunction, therapy specifically focused on boundary setting, books and workshops about healthy family relationships. Women don't have to figure these things out in isolation the way I did. If you're reading this and recognizing yourself in my story, please know that you're not alone and you're not wrong to want better treatment. Your needs matter. Your boundaries are valid. Your right to respect doesn't disappear because someone is related to you. The journey isn't easy, but it's worth it. On the other side of conflict and uncertainty lies the possibility of relationships based on genuine mutual care rather than one-sided obligation. On the other side of disappointing people lies the discovery of who will love you for who you are rather than what you can provide. As I close this very long account of my ongoing journey, I want to return to where I started. That terrible and wonderful Christmas morning when I finally said no. That moment of refusing to cook wasn't just about a meal. It was about refusing to participate in my own diminishment. It was about insisting on my humanity within my own family. It was about choosing dignity over peace, authenticity over approval. The lights that Rebecca left on all night in my apartment weren't just a sign of disrespect. They were a symbol of how I'd been allowing people to drain my resources without consideration. The fact that she arrived expecting a feast after I'd explicitly said I wouldn't cook wasn't just poor communication. It was evidence of how my family had learned to treat my words as suggestions rather than statements. When I think about that woman who opened her door to find her family expecting what she'd refused to provide, I feel enormous compassion for her confusion and pain, but I also feel pride in her courage. At 67 years old, after decades of conditioning to accommodate and please, she found the strength to mean what she said. That moment changed everything, not just for me, but for everyone in my orbit. It rippled outward through relationships, transforming how we understood love and obligation, service and appreciation, individual worth, and family loyalty. It created space for more honest communication, more balanced relationships, more authentic love. Today, 3 years later, my lights get turned off when I want them off. My apartment is my sanctuary rather than a free hotel. My family visits because they want to spend time with me, not because they need something from me. I cook when cooking brings me joy, travel when I want to explore, and say no when requests don't align with my capacity or desires. The woman who was invisible in her own life has become visible. The woman who measured her worth through service has learned to value herself for who she is. The woman who was afraid of family anger has discovered that relationships can survive, and even thrive, through honest confrontation. Have you ever lived through something similar to what I've shared? Have you found yourself giving and giving until you disappeared inside your own generosity? Have you ever had to choose between being loved and being respected, only to discover that real love actually requires respect to survive? Tell me your story in the comments below. Share your own journey of learning to matter, of insisting on your worth, of discovering who you are beyond what you can do for others. And if this story touched something in your heart, if it made you think about your own patterns of giving and receiving, please like this video and subscribe to this channel. Your support helps me continue opening my heart, one story at a time, reaching other people who might need to hear that they're allowed to matter too. Because you do matter. Your needs are valid. Your boundaries are necessary. Your worth isn't determined by how much you can sacrifice for others. You deserve love that doesn't require you to disappear to earn it. And sometimes the most loving thing you can do for everyone, including yourself, is to refuse to cook the turkey, turn off the lights they left on, and insist on being seen as the complete, valuable person you've always been.